The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to Leading with Influence. Tim Baker's my name. Looking forward to working with you over the next 30 minutes, wherever you are, in the morning or the afternoon or the evening. We've got a big audience here for this presentation, so obviously it's got a lot of interest. I wrote this book a couple of years ago because when I went out and I looked at what was out there in terms of influence, what I found was that at one end of the spectrum, there was material that was too academic and it really wasn't practical. So, we just couldn't use it. And then at the other end of the continuum, we had very, very sales type influencing, which really wasn't always applicable for anyone in a leadership role. So it was kind of like there was something in the middle missing. So I thought, well, I'll put together an influencing capabilities profile based on my own work and experience. So that's essentially what I'm going to run through today in the 30 minutes. Now, I just want to make sure that I'm being heard because I could be talking to myself here. So you'll notice over in the right-hand box, there's a question box there, or there's and I'd just like you to write in the word clear. Could you do that for me, please? Because that lets me know that I'm actually being heard. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Jenny. Okay. Anyone else? Yep. Thanks, Adam. Good, good. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mary. I can't keep up with it all. Obviously, I'm coming through loud and clear. Okay, so let's get underway and let's have a look at what I'm going to be covering in this session. Now, you will receive a copy of the slides and you will receive a recording at the end of this. Not immediately after, but you'll receive it in the next 48 hours. And the other thing is, if you do have questions, comments or observations, type them in the question box. I'm happy to take them at any stage. I'm the only one that gets to see those, and so what I'm going to do is respond to those when I see them. Otherwise, I'm not going to leave a sort of awkward pause for the last 5 minutes to answer questions. I'd rather take them as we come. That way we make it as interactive as possible. So, 3 things we're covering. What is influence? What do we actually mean by this term influence? What does the influencing capabilities framework look like? So I just want to share that with you. And what are some of the tools of influence that you might consider using? So a couple of things that you can take out of here that are very practical for you. So that's what we're covering over the next 30 minutes. Now, the first key question I want to ask you, and I actually want you to type in the question box there your answer, but if you can see on the screen there are 4 leaders. You may not, you'd certainly recognise their faces, you'd probably even be able to tell me who they are. But my question to you is, what do they all have in common? Does anyone like to have a shot at that? And just in the question box, what do all 4 of these, they're all leaders, so what do they all have in common? Anyone like to have a guess? Yes, they're all leaders, that's true. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, they've all got enormous influence, that's true. Personality, okay, yes. Perhaps even a strong personality might be a good way of putting it. Anybody else? Okay, let's have a look at that one. I just missed that, there's a couple there. Influence, yes, Willie, you're absolutely spot on. They're all clear about what they're doing, absolutely. They want to make a change. The world, says Robin, absolutely. You've got it. Yeah, they are all, and in case you might be make a change in the world, absolutely. What these 4 have got in common, there's only one who's still alive, and that's the first person at the top of the screen there on the left-hand side. But what all 4 of these people have done is they've had enormous influence in their time on Earth. Now, you may look at those people and say, I don't like that person, or I like that person. You will all have an opinion about these 4 people, and I haven't put them up there because they're great heroes of mine necessarily. But what I wanted to do is to exemplify 4 leaders that are using 4 influencing strategies I'm going to talk about. So I want you just to separate your emotions from what I'm talking about, because I'm sure there's some people here who say, oh, I don't like them, or I like them a lot or whatever. Just relax with that. The main thing is, let's just quickly work out who's who. Up the top here, we've got Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States and climate change activist. Basically, he lost that very famous election to George W. Bush in 2000 through the state of Florida, which was actually decided in the courts, and then went to reinvent himself as a climate change activist. We've got Margaret Thatcher, who was Great Britain's first female Prime Minister and had been in power for 10 years. People either love or hate her. There's no sort of in-between there. Then we have Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was a civil rights activist in the 1960s who wrote one of the greatest speeches of all time in 1965 called I Have a Dream. Well worth going on YouTube and having a look, by the way. But he was able to move a nation and perhaps even a generation towards civil rights awareness. Many people would say that there's still work to be done there. And then we've got Mother Teresa, who has been recently anointed saint by the Catholic Church for her work for poverty-stricken parts of the world, and particularly in the streets of Calcutta and other parts of the world. All of them have had enormous influence, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about each of them in a little bit more detail as we go through. So let's understand what we mean by the term influence, because I think when I mention the word influence, people often have, they might think about it being cunning or manipulative or underhanded or something like that. And of course, that is a form of influence, absolutely. But this is my definition of influence, and it's a pretty simple definition, but it's one that I believe is very important that we get that clear before we go any further. So in my view, influence is the power to make other people agree with your opinion or to get them to do what you want ethically and willingly, or willingly and ethically. Now, I highlighted 3 words. Yes, it is based on a set of power or a form of power. It is about either changing people's opinion about something or getting them to do something that you want them to do. So it could be one or the other. And finally, it's done willingly. In other words, they're doing it because they want to be influenced. And secondly, it's ethical. In other words, it's transparent. We actually know what the leader is attempting to do. So that's my definition of influence. So it does have a moral base to it. And so this is not about being tricky, cunning or underhanded in any way, shape or form. That's not what I'm referring to here. And I think what is important with all this is that there are 3 key variables in any influencing situation. And of course, you don't have time to sit there and think about all this when you're doing this, but if you do step back for a moment and think, obviously you and I have got our own personal style and approach to influence. And it's good to know what that is, because the chances are that you're convinced that your style and approach is actually the style and approach that works for everybody else. And I've got news for you, it doesn't. And I know you know that because you've had times where you've tried to influence somebody, tried to persuade somebody about something, and the glaze goes in their eyes, and you can see very clearly that they're not at all engaged or interested. And of course, you keep banging on with your particular style and approach, and you get nowhere. Now, of course, that's because the other person has their natural style and approach, and it may well be polar opposite to what you like. So, for example, if you like facts and figures and logic and structure, you might find that you're dealing with someone who's quite emotional and really is keen on talking about values and beliefs and things like that. Then obviously that's not going to work. Now, of course, there's a context as well. Different situations require different influencing styles and approaches. Now, you and I can't sit there and analyse all that when we're attempting to influence somebody, but here is the key point out of all of this. If plan A doesn't work, what we need to do is to try plan B or C or even D if possible, because if you keep banging on the way you perhaps prefer to influence, you will get nowhere, or you certainly won't get as far as you'd like with those that perhaps aren't influenced by that style or approach. So influence is unique to the situation. We all have our own bias around how we influence, and how we like to influence, interestingly, is how other people, how we like to be influenced, often how we will influence other people. Now, the other important point before we move on to the actual profile is that you are in the business of influence, so am I. You are actually what we call a professional influencer. So whether you're in sales, whether you're in a leadership role, doesn't matter. Whether you're a parent, you are in the business of actually influence. So therefore, if we accept that you're in the business of influence, then we would also suggest to you that it's probably a good idea to improve your capacity to influence. And it's not as difficult as you might think, but creating a self-awareness about your own style and approach is the first stepping stone to doing that. Now, what you're seeing or will see very shortly on your screen, here it comes now. Gone again, there it is. This is the influencing capabilities framework I put together based on what I said earlier with the gap in the market in relation to a practical influencing framework. So the first thing that you can see on the influencing framework is that it's a 2x2 matrix, which is a pretty typical model. And up the top, you've got a push and a pull style. So what do I mean by push and pull? Okay, here's a little graphic that might assist you with that. So the push style is a driving, proposing, giving information, blocking out other people's point of view style. It's taking the idea to the person. So that's one style, but the other style is the pull style. That's the enabling, that's trying to test understanding, seeking out information and drawing upon that information and building upon it in a more collaborative way. Now, you might say, well, which is more effective? Well, the answer to that is it depends on the situation and who you happen to be trying to influence. So in other words, it's good to have both a push and a pull style depending on the circumstances that you're in. Now, the other dimension is over on the left-hand side. You'll notice there's a logical and an emotional approach. They're pretty self-explanatory, but here's a graphic that can help you understand what I mean by the distinction between the two. So people who like to use logic, like to use facts and evidence, they've usually got, they like to be rational, they're very structured, and they're very measured in how they go about their work. On the other hand, people who are quite emotional in their approach tend to go on the basis of feelings, in other words, things like gut feel, their perceptions, their values, and so on. So that's the two dimensions. Now, within that framework, you've got 4 influencing strategies. One is investigation, which is a push logical strategy. You've got calculation, which is a pull logical strategy. You've got motivation, which is an emotional push strategy. And you've got collaboration, which is a pull emotional strategy. Now, if you decide to do the profile, what you'll find is that it'll categorize you into one of these areas. And then, of course, that's your strength and it's also your blind spot, because it's probably likely that you're using it to great effect. But every now and again you come across somebody where you're having absolutely no luck whatsoever in persuading them. It could be explained by the fact that they have a different influencing strategy or use a different influencing strategy, and you're not willing to budge because you feel comfortable using that particular approach. All right, so let's unpack this a little bit more and understand what that means. So people who like to investigate are people who marshal their facts and figures, and they're quite organised and systematic and logical in the way they go about things. And that was Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States, who very much was a devastating debater, was very, very organised. If you've ever seen that video, Inconvenient Truth, on YouTube, it's just filled with graphs, charts, statistics, and facts and figures about climate change. And that, of course, is the way that he likes to influence other people. So this strategy is often used by a number of professions. So, for example, the police obviously gather evidence, and the whole idea is to gather some evidence and put it before the court to get a conviction. Or scientists and researchers will have a tendency to have a hypothesis, and they'll go out and either prove or disprove that hypothesis. So in workplace incidents where, safety or harassment is involved, where you've had incidents around a safety issue or harassment, generally speaking, the way to influence there is to do a rigorous and thorough investigation. And a report comes out, and on the basis of that report, decisions are made. That would be a logical, sensible way of dealing with those sorts of incidents. But a different context is if you're trying to change initiatives and you want to engage people emotionally, in other words, gain their hearts and minds to a particular cause, investigation is probably not going to work particularly well for you. So you can see that in different contexts, these things can be used in different ways. Now, the calculation strategy, this strategy is a strategy where, and I guess I couldn't think of a better word than calculation, and often when you hear that word, it sounds a little bit Machiavellian, doesn't it? But at the end of the day, it's about promoting the positives of the proposal and highlighting the weaknesses of the current situation. So it's kind of like giving you leverage. So, for example, I walked past Harvey Norman's about 6 months ago, and there was a sign outside the door. And for those of you that don't know, Harvey Norman's is a large sort of retail outlet in Australia. And there was a sign there saying 40% off all laptops, and I wasn't planning to buy a laptop, but I thought, well, look, you know what, I'll go in and have a look. So I went in, and there was another sign on the door as soon as I got in saying, must purchase by the close of business today. So in other words, I was put into a position of leverage. I'm seduced by the 40%, but when I get on the door, I realise that I've got to purchase by the close of business, and that's what retailers do, and they do it very well. Now, Margaret Thatcher, as I mentioned earlier, Great Britain's first female Prime Minister, was a clear calculator. In other words, people knew exactly where they stood with her. You were either with her or against her, and she would often divide and conquer using that sort of strategy. And she was crystal clear about what she believed in, and she explained that to people, and she explained also the consequences of not going down her pathway, if you like. So that's a good example of somebody who exhibited that particular strategy. So people, as I mentioned, in sales, financial advisors, animal trainers, if you look at an animal trainer, they usually have say if you're in a circus and you're watching the ponies, the trainers would have a pocket full of treats and a whip in one hand and a pocket full of treats in the other. So they'd use these interchangeably to get the animals to do whatever they needed to do. And of course, teachers, if you think about a good teacher that you had at school, hopefully you had one, you would probably recognise that you knew where you stood with them. The line in the sand was very, very clear, and so there was pros and cons for that. So any change in the workplace that directly affects the capabilities of people to do their job. So, for example, if the leader's trying to sell the positives of some sort of change, like doing some harassment or bullying legislation, training, and talking about the self-interest of the individual, and talking about the consequences of not doing that, well, that would be a useful use of calculation as a strategy. But in situations where working in teams is critically important, it's probably not quite so good, because you create this divide and rule mentality, and that doesn't work particularly well. So it can be used in the right place at the right time with the right people in the right way. Now, so what we've looked at is those two are what I would say above the line. In other words, they're both logical approaches to influence. Now, the next two I'm going to share with you are emotional approaches to influence. And of course, if you could divide the world up, you'd probably find that about approximately 50% of the population anywhere would be influenced by emotion more than logic. So what I guess the important point about all this is that if you want to be influential with more and more people, the idea is to be more and more versatile in the way you do business. So motivators use emotion to influence, and they're usually big picture thinkers, and they will usually link a compelling vision of the future to a cause. So often, they'll have a way with words. They might be good storytellers, and they create vivid pictures of what they're aiming to do. And as I mentioned before, Martin Luther King was a great orator, and it might well be worth going onto YouTube and just having a look at that speech, I Have a Dream, because I think you'll find an incredible ability to be persuasive by using rhetoric in a very, very timely way. But you don't have to be a great orator to be a motivator. Part of it is just about telling stories. If you look at people out there that are actually tuned into using the motivational strategy, entrepreneurs, if you look at Richard Branson, or if you looked at, say, an Elon Musk, all of these people are out to sell a big dream, a big picture. And what happens is they surround themselves with people who will assist them, who are excited about their vision and will assist them to achieve it. Advertising executives have a split second to get yours and my attention, and they do that by using emotion rather than logic. Public relations agents, we've got artistic directors, all of those people use motivation as a strategy to influence and persuade. So if you're developing a sense of commitment, and that is you want to win the hearts and minds of people to a particular strategic direction, as I mentioned earlier, this is the way to go, because people can join a compelling cause, if you like. But if logic is important, in other words, for example, if all of a sudden the budgets were cut in your organisation, you may well need to have an explanation for that, because obviously you need to know why and where those budget cuts are occurring before you may be committed to doing something different. And finally, the collegial collaborator. Now, collaborators, they also use emotion to influence, but what they do is they persuade people by engaging them in the team. So they're team builders. They create harmony within a team, and a good example perhaps would be Mother Teresa, who ultimately had a lot of NGOs and supporters and people who were helping her achieve her realisation and her dream, who were volunteers, and she was able to marshal their support and build some camaraderie and esprit de corps amongst those teams. So that's an example of someone that may. So the difference between collaboration is that you get people committed to each other, whereas the motivator gets people committed to a vision. Now, let's have a look at people who, a conductor of an orchestra is a classic example of somebody who is a collaborator. They don't play a musical instrument, but they can create an ensemble by drawing into the piece of music different sections of the orchestra at different times. So where you would use this, of course, is where you've got strong, diverse views, and then you want to actually discuss this in the team, collaborate and discuss the different points of view. This would be a good way of persuading and getting people to be on the same page. But again, if people wanted to know the logic of a decision, in other words, why are we introducing this new system, they probably want to know the rationale and the reason for that before they're interested in collaborating about how it might work. All right, so there's a lot of different possibilities there. If you've got any questions, please type in. I've just got one question here. It's a very good one, actually. Question is, if you've got to give a presentation in front of a group of people, which is the best style? Well, that's a great question. The answer to that is all four. So you start off by giving people the facts, okay, so that you're abreast of the situation. You may well talk to them about the how it links to the strategic direction of the business or whatever it is that you're doing, then you may well decide to engage people in conversation, get people to answer questions, ask questions, and so forth. So I'm now using collaboration. And my final slide of my presentation may well be around pros and cons. Here are all the pros for doing it my way. And if we don't go down this road, here are all the problems that will occur. And how could you not be influential with an audience if you used all four? And it's based on the assumption that the larger the audience, the more likely it is that you're going to get all four different strategies or people who think in those four different ways in the room. All right, now I just wanted to quickly share with you the influencing capabilities profile. You can do that online if you wish to do so. It gives you a 14-page report, and I'm just giving you a very quick overview of what that looks like. What it does is it shows you what your style and approach is, and you can see on the screen now, this is not my profile, by the way, but it is somebody's. So obviously I haven't put a name to it, but you can see that it gives them percentages around which is their natural style. And you'll notice something interesting, that there are four underpinning capabilities underneath each. So it talks about, drills down into some capabilities that are critically important that support that strategy. So if I was working with this person that you're seeing in front of you, I'd probably suggest to them that they probably need to spend more time sharing ownership, because they've got 55% there. So that's probably not an area of that's naturally a preference for them. And maybe, on the other hand, they might be sort of overusing some of these other strategies that are quite high. So you see, it gives you a kind of like a train track to run on, an opportunity to start looking at your own influencing capability. Then you get graphs like this, which essentially shows you the hierarchy of capabilities, from great strengths to areas that need to be worked on, and so on. You've got charts to look at how you compare, your style, push-pull, logical, emotional, how it compares, and so forth. So you get that sort of interest and so forth. So there's quite a lot. There's also here an opportunity where you can click on the video and actually see those four leaders that I mentioned earlier, and watch them in action, and you can see their characteristics in play. So it's for a cost of $79, you can complete that, and you just simply go online and complete it, and away you go. So the other thing I'd like to say to you just before we wrap up is that if you'd like a copy of my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, which has 65 practical tools of influence, all categorized around the four strategies. I've got 3 copies left. I'm just looking over it. I have 3 copies left, and I'm willing to give you a 20% discount if you send me an email by the close of business today. The first 3 will get a copy of my book signed, and I'll send it out to you, and I'll also send out to you a coupon, so you'll get your 20% discount. And the other thing I'd just like to say before I close is I have a Lunch and Learn series coming up, and it's starting on the 14th of September, and you're most welcome to join. The cost is $295, and what happens is you can see that you get 6 units of 1 hour duration. You'll notice Unit 2 is enhancing your personal influence. So if you choose, you could do this for $295, which will include the actual influencing capabilities profile. So I just thought you might be interested in that opportunity. If you'd like more information about what each of these topics are and how the whole thing works, send me an email. I'm happy to send you out a flyer which has got all the topics, the content, and what you get basically for your money. So folks, that's pretty much it for me. If you've got any questions, comments, observations, you can send me an email. I'm going to send you out a copy of the slides and the broadcast So we'll give you a chance to review any of this. But in the meantime, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you very much for attending, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you and goodbye.